Dr. Roger Tang and Dr. David Shack from Triple Ring Technologies, who are going to be talking to us about successful product development and specifically through that lens of medical device development. And so I will leave it to the two of you to introduce yourselves and jump on in.
Great, thank you, Janine, and welcome everybody. Roger and I are very excited to be here to share our thoughts on product development. We will certainly be getting into the sort of heart of the matter as we work through the presentation, but just maybe at a high level, you know, we come from a company, Triple Ring Technologies, that, you know, our whole life is technology and then ultimately product development. So we've certainly seen a thing or two in our careers and through our work at Triple Ring, and we're very excited to share some of the learnings we've had and some of our view on how product development can be done, frankly, more successfully and more predictably. And you know, the simple answer to what to expect from a successful medical device product development experience is a successful medical device. And there's a lot that goes into that. And we'll certainly be walking through a lot of that with you today. So quick introduction of myself, and then I'll pass it over to Roger. I guess the main difference between Roger and I is he's a proud member of the UC family. I am not, I guess to my detriment for this crowd. My background, postgraduate, has been a series of startup companies, and then ultimately a fairly long stint running hardware development at BD Biosciences and flow cytometry, and then on to Agile, another startup, and then now joining Triple Ring this past year. My association with Triple Ring actually goes quite a ways back. I've been a client at Triple Ring at different companies, and at Signature Bioscience and X-Ray. That's where I first encountered Roger. We worked together, and the founders of Triple Ring came out of those two companies. My background is primarily in systems development of one form or another, always with an eye to either diagnostics or some kind of life science application. So with that, let me pass it over to Roger.
Thanks, Dave. And as Dave mentioned, I am a proud member of the UC family, getting my PhD at UC Berkeley in San Francisco. Spent most of my time after leaving academia in product development companies, as Dave mentioned, at Signature Bioscience at a startup, and then at a couple of other companies in the biotool space. Currently, I am responsible for making sure that we have the right resources at the right time for all the different projects that we do at Triple Ring. And with that, we'll just dive a little bit. But before I leave that, a little bit more about Triple Ring. Hopefully you get a chance to look us up. We are a co-development company. One of our goals is to help science-driven innovators, entrepreneurs, and companies realize their vision and achieve commercial success by applying our talented resources, our processes, and our structure to solve problems, launch products, and create new businesses. We are primarily in the medical device and life sciences space, although we have been known on occasion to design a camera for a satellite in space. These are just examples of the kinds of products that we've worked on. I'll point out a couple that you can learn a little bit more on the website. This is our marijuana breathalyzer, which is cool. It's how do you measure marijuana on a roadside, in a roadside application. This one here is a system where we measure blood oxygen in tissue using optical techniques. But probably 80–90% of what we do is in the medical device life sciences space. So we have 16+ years of experience as a company working in that area. So let me start off by basically showing you my favorite thing. So if you're familiar with the 21 CFR 820 requirements from the FDA on developing medical devices, it fits on a pamphlet that you can stick into your pocket if you want. You can read it at night. But at the end of the day, these regulations are pretty terse. And what the FDA has done is to come out with a guidance document, a number of guidance documents around how to interpret the federal regulations to develop a regulated medical device. And if you get a chance to read this, please do. And one of the key diagrams in that document is what we call the waterfall development diagram. How do we start with user needs and ultimately come out with a medical device? And this is sort of a way they've sort of distilled what's in the regulations into a process, a medical development process using design controls. Now, what often happens in most companies that sort of try to implement that waterfall development process is to use a phase gate or a stage gate process. And the traditional development model moves from phase to phase, making sure that you close the different requirements of each phase and then have a formal transition to each phase. Now, the interesting thing about this is this assumes that everything about product development is a linear process, that you start out with a concept, marketing or whoever has come up with a concept for a product, that you checked all the boxes, you moved on to planning out how you're going to actually develop that process, get into the meat of it, designing the device or designing the technology, and then ultimately seeing if it works in a test phase and hopefully launching that product to the end user. Now, in this model, mentally, we all think about all the technical difficult work being done in this design and test phase. And we often call what's behind it the fuzzy front end. The fuzzy front end being the place we don't want to be. As quickly as possible, we want to move away from the fuzzy front end and get to the technical work. What inevitably happens, however, in this process is that we're developing complex systems that sometimes don't work the way we think, sometimes don't fulfill the requirements that we want to have. And there's always this inevitable loop back that happens during the technical work. And the later that happens, the worse it is in terms of cost, both in time and in money. Now, the worst cases actually can be quite a bit worse in real life. If you ever try to have to loop back once you've thought you were ready to launch, then it becomes really expensive. And of course, the worst case scenario is when your customers, your end users tell you that you've made a mistake or that you have done something that doesn't fulfill their requirements. So the question is, how do you try to avoid that? How do you try to mitigate this costly loopbacks that happen late in the development cycle? And mentally, you have to change your model. And what we've described is mentally changing your model by pushing as much of the difficult technical work and other work that's complex as far forward in the development process as possible, where the difficult work is done. So it's not the fuzzy front end, that it's not fuzzy at all. And the model we think about is sort of making sure that we do all the knowledge gap closure early. And we talk about an iterative planning and test and design phase that looks a lot like this, where basically you're constantly iterating early on and reducing risk and closing knowledge gaps. And the best way that I can describe this is actually by a great example that was once relayed to me many years ago from a mentor named Ron Marsiglio, who basically said, look, here's an example of how you really need to think about product development. And the example that everyone I think knows is the Wright brothers, and Wright brothers and the, of course, man-controlled, heavier-than-air powered flight. So let's take a step back for a moment. The year is late 1800s. Basically, we have two brothers who are working as bicycle sales and repair folks, high school graduated, and they wanted to conquer this problem. How do we build something that can be man-controlled and be able to be fly when other people hadn't been able to be successful? The ultimate question you should ask is, other people were more educated, other people were better funded, yet the Wright brothers were able to conquer this problem. And so the question is how? I would like to say that they did something where they tried to reduce all the risks that they could up front, analyze and test before design. And so what did the Wright brothers do that was really something that we need to make sure we always remember? One, they always did their homework. They knew nothing about aerodynamics. So they basically had to come up to speed. They requested all available information they could from the Smithsonian Institution. They studied the lift tables from various aeronautical engineers of the day. They corresponded with the experts at the time to basically do their homework to understand what was the problem they were trying to solve. And so they looked at this problem of flight and all the complex things that needed to be in an airplane, and they really boiled it down to three things. They identified three key knowledge gaps. The three key knowledge gaps that they identified were, one, lift. How do we get an airplane off the ground? What's going to allow me to bring this plane off the ground? Two, how am I going to create enough thrust in the engine and constraints that I had so that I could get the airplane off the ground? And ultimately, when I got off the ground, how am I going to control the airplane? So they really broke the problem down to these three key knowledge gaps. And what did they end up doing? They basically ended up closing these knowledge gaps by performing careful analysis and experiments. I don't know if some of you have gotten a chance to see this, but they built a wind tunnel. They built one of the first wind tunnels, and they spent months understanding the relationship between shape and the lift it would generate. And they built model kites. They built systems where they could figure out how the control structures had to be when they were in flight. And ultimately, my favorite quote from Wright is basically the non-glamorous lab work is absolutely critical to the success of the project. It's all these little things that you have to do to close knowledge gaps that ultimately dictate if you're going to be successful later on. And you don't jump to building the airplane right away. You actually solve the problems that allow you to jump to building the airplane. And of course, we know how the story ends. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers, of course, flew. Now, what was not known, what may be less known at the time, was that the Wright brothers sent a telegram to their father basically saying, success assured, keep quiet, because they knew they were going to be able to fly. They'd done all their homework, they'd done all the experiments, they'd done all the knowledge gap closure, they identified all the things they needed to do, and they closed those knowledge gaps in order to do it. And so I always look at the example because, one, it's memorable, and we all know that we fly today, and why did that happen? These two bicycle mechanics spent the time to learn all the different things that were necessary to build an airplane. But I always follow this pattern. We always follow this pattern in almost every single project that we do at Triple Ring. In fact, every single project should follow this pattern. The lessons from the Wright brothers are, one, do your homework, understand what exists out there. You're not the smartest person in the world. There's a lot of smart people out there. So find out what they know, understand what is out there. Two, look at the whole problem and then break it up into logical subsystems. Any instrument you make has a logical breakdown. What's the optical subsystem? What's the fluidic subsystem? What's the disposable piece? What's the interaction of the user with the screen? You know, whatever the subsystems are, there's a logical breakdown. And all those different subsystems identify the things that you don't know, identify the things that you have to figure out, because if you can't figure it out, you're not going to get the airplane off the ground or be able to control it. So identify the key knowledge gaps and do the hard work. Do the hard work around analysis, experiments. We say design later, but really it's miniature design, designed to understand and close your knowledge gaps. And once you close those knowledge gaps, then you're able to finally design the final product and design and build the final airplane. So when we think about a different way of product development by pulling all the risk as early as possible, using an iterative process to close knowledge gaps that smooths out essentially what happens after you've done that. So that's sort of a framework that I like to think about product development. And with that, I'll leave it to Dave to sort of go into a little bit more detail of an example and speak to some other elements of product development. Dave? Great. I'm going to close mine down and let you pick it up.
All right. There we go. So are we seeing the whole slide there, Roger?
Yep.
Great. So, Roger has kind of walked through the really important underpinnings of how to approach a problem, especially when you're starting with something that, either hasn't been done before or, has been done before, but you're sort of adding something, significantly new to what you're doing, and that there's going to be unknowns. There's a trivial case of we're just kind of repeating exactly what's been done before, but you rarely encounter that in a real product development setting, because why would you? So Roger mentioned the message of success assured. So, okay, great, success assured, now what? The Wright brothers achieved their powered and controlled flight, but that's a long way from manufacturing airplanes to sell into commercial and other uses. So, I just have to hide my video, it's blocking me. So, the point of what Roger was describing was to identify and address the key knowledge gaps. And so, all that's really left is to deliver a product, right? But that product has to be safe and effective and manufacturable and serviceable. Probably people want it to be easy to use and not to break, and, cost effective, compliant, and on and on and on. So, it's never really, quote unquote, just engineering. Once you've solved these problems, there's lots of complexity that remains in going from the point where you've really established that the technology and the fundamental designs that you're running with work, to actually having something in manufacturing that can be done sort of repeatedly and will always work. So there's a shift. There's a shift from the learning aspects that Roger was talking about to more doing. And as you might imagine, there's a bit of a different mindset associated with that. And in a following slide, I'll talk a little bit more of that. So, the fact of life in product development is that there's always pressure. There's always pressure generally to move as quickly as possible, generally to move efficiently as possible. Time and money and people are sort of precious resources. And so, if you had all the time and money in the world, there's nothing that you can't do. But what can you do when there's market realities? You need to hit a market window. You need to get something achieved before your next round of funding is possible. So, the pure technical aspects of product development are really kind of spiced up a lot by the business and other economic realities. Now, just as a side note, I have an assertion here that predictability is actually more important than speed. Of course, everybody just says, I need this as soon as possible, and that's how they run. But what businesses really need to do is to be able to plan and understand what's coming, and assign the resources, and have the money in place, and signal the market, and all the things associated with a successful product development effort. And really, the bane of that is unpredictability. There's all kinds of reasons why things can get unpredictable. Of course, the sort of top of the list here is design flaws, and Roger talked about the fact that the later you find a design flaw or a requirement error, which is even worse, the more expensive it is to recover from that. The worst case obviously being, your customers are telling you what's wrong, and now you've got to sort of not only change the design, but potentially change the manufacturing. So the earlier you understand these things and can react to them, the better. And this sort of ties in, exactly with what Roger was describing with how the Wright brothers approached the development of powered flight. Coming out with difficult or expensive to manufacture designs. I mean, there's a lot of focus during the development process on getting something to work. But if you can't build it, and if you can't build it for the cost that will allow it to be successful in the market, all the performance in the world doesn't really matter. And so I'll definitely sort of come back to this topic towards the end of the presentation, but it's a really important consideration. And then, of course, just the straight underestimation of what it takes to get stuff done. It's interesting, companies that do this sort of thing over and over again, you'd think you'd know exactly what it takes to do a certain kind of project or a certain kind of design. But more often than not, you find people being over optimistic and not learning from history. So, this is by no means a complete list, but product development is a risky business, and the point of what we're trying to get across here today, and hopefully we can share some good learnings with you, is that how do you manage that risk, and how do you handle the unknowns that can potentially drive you off track, so that you do end up with a successful product on the time that you need it. So, what can you do about this? Well, first thing you can try is just do what you've always done. This project didn't go well. Fire the project manager. People aren't working hard enough. This, if you're sort of paying attention, is essentially the common definition of insanity. You're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. So, let's move on past this one. One of the things that I've certainly seen a lot, especially in the larger companies that I've worked for, is that when things are becoming unpredictable, management loves to implement a more prescriptive process. So, we've got these phase gate processes, we've got, gate and design reviews, more information from the team, more reporting out, more management control. So I'll leave it as a thought experiment for all of you to sort of predict how effective more management control will be on managing risk on a highly dynamic product development process. So, maybe it's time to try something new. And so what we're talking about here is really adapting and adopting Agile and Lean methods. And I'll say as a side, getting into sort of the details of what Agile and Lean methods are at a level of sort of tutorial to how to implement them is the subject of many books and many presentations. We're going to talk more about sort of what you gain by doing it, and if hopefully this inspires you, that there's all kinds of follow-up learning to be done. So you really changing the way development teams operate. It's a new mindset. It's incorporating this knowledge-driven approach not only at the beginning but really throughout the entire development cycle. So just at a high level, I think there's sort of two complementary ideas here. The Agile methodologies, which we're sort of calling learning dominant here, and I think Roger really sort of covered what that is. But there's also the Lean portion, and for those of you familiar with Lean, it's commonly talked about in manufacturing settings. But it really applies to product development as well, and it really seeks to obviously at its heart eliminate wastes. The wastes in manufacturing are different than the wastes in product development, but it's looking at how do you manage your information so everybody knows what they need to know when they need to know it, and as questions get answered and knowledge gaps get filled, how are you managing all that? It's leveraging design standards. If someone has done something before that applies directly, don't reinvent the wheel. It's leveraging that sort of institutional knowledge, whether it's inside or outside your organization. Check sheets, it's another. It's getting into kind of the nitty gritty of these are the things that we want to make sure that we're paying attention to, and I've got it written down, so I know I'm going to do it. Test-driven development. This could be a whole presentation on itself, and this is something that we are sort of very keenly interested in and apply at Triple Ring. Simply put, it's really taking an approach that looks at what a component or a subsystem or even an entire system needs to do to be successful, and then writing tests to demonstrate that success as you've defined it, and then doing the design that's essentially aimed at making that test work. Because if you've made that test work and if you've designed the test correctly, you know that success is assured. Automated test is another piece of this. Never do something twice that you can automate. Of course, this is sort of well baked into the software development world, but it applies generally across all the domains. And then both sides of this Agile and Lean dyad, both seek to have continuous improvement. We're always learning. We're always applying our learnings back. It's never, okay, we figured out how to do this thing, we're just going to go do it. It's like, how do we make it better the next time? How do we make it better in the short term? How do we make it better in the long term? So I mentioned the mindsets. This is just a graphic to kind of sort of illustrate the shift. If you can imagine time going from the early parts of having a concept right through to when you're having your product getting into production, at the very beginning, really most of what you're thinking about and doing is involving identifying the knowledge gaps, learning what you need to learn to close those, and as you move along, you start to sort of wrestle all those things under control, and sort of the learning dominant part of the activity starts to ramp down, and the task dominant part really starts to ramp up. You're getting away from answering sort of thorny questions of will it work and how do we make it work, to how do we get this done. So with all the foregoing, both what Roger shared and the previous few slides that I've shared, we want to illustrate this with a story of two approaches. And this is a hypothetical situation that we'll kind of walk through and see how two teams using different methodologies fare in a similar circumstance. And before I continue, I have to credit the generation of this example, and in fact some of the slide content, to Aaron Joseph, who's a associate of Rogers and mine, who is very expert in this domain, and our thanks to Aaron for allowing us to share this with you. Okay, so just to set the scene, we're looking at a story where a company wants to develop their next generation of their infusion pump. And I should point out that there's a picture here of a particular Hospira infusion pump. This is not about that company. This just happened to be a picture that shows what an infusion pump looks like. So this is really a fictitious example. So no incrimination of any real persons. So what they're trying to achieve here is, smaller, lighter, easier to use. There's lots of players in the infusion pump business, and fundamentally at the end of the day, infusion pumps sort of do what they do, and sort of how do you differentiate yourself in the marketplace. So because of market pressures, there's a very aggressive schedule being imposed on this development. They'd like to get it into the market in 2 years. And in order to do that, they've really only got 16 months to get to the point of submitting to FDA. So, prior to the point in time where this story starts, the internal advanced research department has come up with a new pump mechanism that they feel is going to really allow the company to have a significantly improved product, but they haven't used this new pump yet. And they've also identified some new battery technology that allows them to meet their market needs. And again, just to reiterate, all of this new technology needs to be incorporated into a product ready for manufacturing in 2 years. So we're going to look at two teams. We're going to look at Walter's team. So Walter's team has a very experienced project lead. They have access to all of the resources they need, both technical and otherwise, all of the technical domains and the clinical folks, UX experts, on and on and on. And they're going to follow the traditional waterfall approach that Roger showed you earlier. We're also going to look at Grace's team. Like Walter's team, they have an experienced project lead and all the resources they need, but they're going to take a different approach, and they're going to take the Agile-Lean approach that we're talking about here. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that new product development is risky. So, we've got two experienced project leaders. What do they need to do to manage those risks and ensure the success of their products? And so when we think about risks in product development, there's a long list, and this isn't even the whole list. Obviously, there's technical risk. Will it work? There's clinical risk. Will it, provide the clinical efficacy that's needed? Is it the right product? Has marketing sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of, asking for the right thing? Regulatory risk, legal, IP, financial, you name it. All of this is of consideration to a successful product development. And all of this is the responsibility of a good project leader to make sure that it's addressed. So I won't spend too much time on this. This is just to kind of sort of reiterate what Roger was saying about the typical phases in a product development phase gate cycle. There's all kinds of flavors of phase gate processes, but more or less they boil down to something like this. And just to quickly kind of reiterate, once you're sort of past the concept phase where you establish a business case and what you need your product to do, and have some concept around what the product is. That's when the heavy lifting of detailed planning and looking at hazard analysis and understanding all your various business and regulatory strategies, moving into development where obviously the main bulk of the design is done, but also noting down here, thinking about test methods and also manufacturing process development. Come back to this a little bit later. It's really important that manufacturing processes and other aspects of manufacturing transfer are considered very early in the design cycle and not as an afterthought. Once the prototypes are built and you have a design in hand that people are generally happy with the pieces of, that's when sort of integration and verification and demonstrating that it does what you said it was going to do, and then ultimately into the pre-production activities around clinical testing and submission, as well as manufacturing transfer. So intent here is not to sort of get into the weeds on this, but just to kind of make sure everybody sort of has a decent picture of the main moving pieces of development. Okay, so we're going to look at how these projects unfold. So at the beginning, getting started on this 2-year effort, Walter's team begins their detailed project planning. They're sort of diving, headfirst into phase 1. They're spending a lot of effort writing their product requirements and making sure that they've got, system and subsystem requirements sort of really fleshed out and agreed to, and they'll be doing their hazard analysis. Grace's team is taking a bit of a different approach. So rather than sort of having a multi-100 line Gantt chart that attempts to predict exactly what someone's going to be doing 8 to 10 months out, they have a high level project plan of where the big moving pieces are. They're also beginning to write their preliminary requirements, again, not to the level of completeness and detail that Walter's team's doing, but enough to get them going on the assumption that there's going to be sort of a living relationship with these requirements as the development goes on. They too need to do their hazard analysis, but unlike Walter's team, they're really diving into identifying what the knowledge gaps are. There's a new pump, there's a new battery. They want this to be easier to use, so there's a whole new software UI. So they're identifying what those issues are and thinking about what they need to do to close those knowledge gaps. That's kind of expensive. Walter's team has, maybe a handful of people doing paper exercises. And now Grace's team is starting to really expand out and have technical resources getting involved and sort of thinking, in more detail about some of these technology issues. So, a quarter in, Walter's team has done all their planning. They've done a comprehensive look at the product requirements. They've done their hazard analysis, and they are rewarded by having checked off their phase 1 first gate requirements, and they're ready to move on to phase 2. Grace's team, on the other hand, has their sort of dynamic high-level project planning going on. They've looked at their requirements and done their hazard analyses, but they're sort of hard at work closing the knowledge gaps. They're testing that new pump and learning about it. They're looking at the new battery and understanding sort of the performance limitations or benefits of it. They're doing rapid evaluation of the proposed UI designs. They're also spending time actually going out to hospitals and looking at pumps that are in use. And as I mentioned, as part of the evaluation of the UI designs, the software team is churning out these sort of regular sprints. They're not pretty, but they really cover what the UI is intending to do, and they have sort of sufficient UI functionality to allow to be put in front of prospective users, internal and potentially even external, to get an understanding of where this UI is headed and what some of the benefits and limitations are. So let me take a step to the side from telling the story for a second and think about, in a typical company, as we've said, there's always a lot of pressure to get things done with limited resources, get things done quickly, get things done predictably. And typically, management, the easiest way for people to kind of know that things are progressing is to know that all the tasks that have been laid out are getting done or not. There's experience in what it takes to do projects in a traditional way, and so there's some baselines about are you using too many or too few people? Are you spending money at the right rate? And there's a lot of pressure to make these key design decisions sort of at the beginning as much as possible, so that the team can just sort of run hard toward the finish line. So all of this kind of environment is really set up to support a traditional development approach. So it's, if you can imagine, it's a bit difficult to kind of go against the grain and not have things that are sort of easily checked off a list and not be sort of using resources in the pattern that the company is used to. So there's a bit of headwind in order to do this. So keep that in mind as we kind of go through, and we'll hopefully see why this is worthwhile. Okay, so we're moving along. We're still in the first year, but we're 3 quarters in. Walter's team has been hard at work in their phase 2. They've done all their hardware design. They've got a prototype built. Software is integrating their output with the hardware. There's been, a detailed design risk analysis, and now they're starting to get going on their testing plans and method development. And the manufacturing process, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is starting to get underway, including, and we'll talk about this some more later, starting to think about the supply chain and qualifying, who's going to be able to supply the pieces and parts for this product when it ultimately gets to manufacturing. And they're coming up toward their gate 2 exit, and so there's lots of documents that need to be prepared for that, and they're working on that. What's going on in Grace's team? Well, they've done extensive testing. They've wrapped up their testing on the new pump. They've discovered some interesting things about the new pump and have developed a couple of alternative designs in order to address those. Similarly, they've done extensive testing on the battery and have come up with some alternative designs as well. So they're doing the kind of cycle that Roger was describing early in the presentation, where they have identified what they don't know, done testing to find out what they need to know, and are reacting that and iterating that sort of early in the cycle. The UI evaluations that I mentioned before, so there's been all this formative human factors tests and a robust feedback loop on sort of what works and what doesn't. And now finally they've finished their phase 1 gate 1 requirements. So they're almost a full phase behind Walter's team right now. So by all objective measures, Grace's team isn't necessarily doing so well. So why are they so far behind? Well, they discovered that the pump has some reliability issues, and they've been spending their time kind of addressing those. They've discovered that the batteries overheat when installed, and they've been working on design mitigations for that. And all this UI testing, well, frankly, the first few shots at it weren't very good, and they learned that, and they updated their UI design, and now the third iteration that they've been through is really testing well. So they're really in quite good shape. But of course, on the calendar and as we progress through the phases, they're still nominally behind. Okay, so now we get towards the end of the story here. Now we're into the second year. It's about 6 months later from the previous one. Walter's team has now officially finished their phase 2 deliverables, and they're getting into phase 3, doing the system integration. And now, lo and behold, they're discovering that there's a problem with the battery. And they've now just started to think about what they need to do to address that. There's been a number of software bugs because they haven't really been running the software as a user would. And so there's a lot of bug discovery, and the team is fixing them. But of course, because they're so focused on getting to a stable set of functional software, they have not been able to do any human factors testing until they can get that fixed. And of course, they're also starting to do their phase 3 activities for writing all the protocols for verification and validation, and manufacturing process development sort of is ongoing. Okay, but there's problems, right? We know there's problems because Grace's team has found these problems. But when's Walter's team gonna know that the pump has a problem? They've discovered the battery problem, but the pump only fails after 3,000 cycles, and maybe Walter's team hasn't sort of hit that threshold yet. So there's something looming for Walter's team that they don't even know about yet. Also, they haven't been able to do their human factors testing on the software. So we know that the first couple of iterations of software weren't necessarily successful in Grace's team's hands. So it's probably likely that Walter's team is going to encounter the same situation. So now Grace's team has finished their phase 2 finished their phase 2. So now effectively, on the scorecard, they're tied with Walter's team. but they've also done their design verification testing, including all their certification for, electrical and electromagnetic compliance. And in fact, they've moved so far ahead that they've finished their phase 3 activities and they're getting ready for their phase 4 validation. So by doing all of the things that they did early on, they've managed to not only catch up to Walter's team, but pass Walter's team. So let's look at this a little more graphically. So, the message here is that the Agile and Lean methods that Grace's team are using, we're really all about discovering problems and fixing them as early as possible in the design cycle. So you can see the peak problem-solving activity for Walter's team didn't come till about 80% of the planned time through the schedule, while Grace's team was doing all of that from between about 20 and 40%. So once Grace's team had sort of really got on top and gotten to that, in the Wright brothers context, success assured point, it was really much more predictable for them to get all of the remaining activities done. And you can see that in this hypothetical example, they came in neatly at 100% of the planned time. Whereas because Walter's team was now busy finding and fixing problems when they should have been doing all their late stage activities, they went overtime, and overtime is over budget, and overtime is potentially missing a market window. And so when we think about sort of what's a successful outcome for a product development process, it's really being able to manage all of these unknowns and manage these risks and get them under control as early as possible, so that the act of executing on the more, and I hesitate to use the word rote, but rote aspects of getting everything done toward the end, can really proceed smoothly and not have your development team scrambling around fixing problems when they should be just either participating in the test and qualification or frankly fading out and being assigned to other work that needs to be done for the company. So that's really the moral of the story. I mean, there's always risk in product development. And focusing the early efforts on addressing those risks just naturally makes the later stages predictable. And as I said earlier on, predictability is really important. And it ultimately translates to speed, but it's really what a business needs to have to be successful. And the other message here is that, even though Walter's team looked like it was on schedule and was, getting high marks for efficiency and effectiveness, it was really hiding a lot of problems that weren't being discovered until much too late. Our conclusion is that the traditional waterfall approach doesn't really do an effective enough job at addressing risks in a timely fashion, and that the Agile-Lean approach really is the answer to getting the key milestones of a regulatory submission on time and a product launch on time. And of course, this is a medical device example and talking about the regulatory submissions, but this is really applicable to just about any development effort. I'm going to take a quick turn here away from the story and in my last couple of slides, really just talk a little bit about transfer to manufacturing, because manufacturing sometimes gets forgotten about, and it gets considered as, oh, well, that's something that happens at the end, and sort of the cliched phrase is that the development team does what they do and then throws it over the wall to the manufacturing folks, and then they're left to sort out what to do about it. It's hopefully obvious that that's a bad idea, and that really the keys to a successful transfer to manufacturing is really having the considerations of all the manufacturing aspects, as well as participation of manufacturing people, operating in concert with the development activities, almost from the very beginning of the design cycle. So I'm sure you've all heard of the term design for manufacturability, or otherwise known as DFM. There's a lot of aspects to that. And I should say, more recently, I think people sort of have moved away from DFM and think more about DFX, where X can be, reliability, serviceability, any number of other things. I think the concepts here really hold for all of those, but in the interest of the scope of this presentation, focus primarily on the manufacturability, although you could argue that addressing one often has benefits for the others. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is that design for manufacturability in terms of sort of the straight consideration of how you design something, what you're designing, needs to be baked in from the very beginning. Oftentimes I've seen projects unfold where, there's really very little input or consideration, from or about manufacturing, and it's all about sort of, getting the thing to work and getting it to meet the, performance specifications. And then at the end, it's like, okay, well, now let's look at it and see what we need to change in order to sort of improve manufacturability before we start to build it. I hope if you've heard nothing else in this foregoing presentation, changing things late is bad. It's expensive, it's disruptive, and the outcomes are rarely ideal because you've got all kinds of constraints that you've built into a design by the time you get to the end of the cycle. The other thing that is important, and again, this is something that I think happens in a lot of settings, that design for manufacturing is really just a list of rules. Use these fasteners. Give us these tolerances. You name it. There's just sort of a checklist that designers are handed and say, just follow these rules. And that's great. There's a place for that. And I use the fastener example because this one seems to come up a lot. Manufacturing people I've known and work with, get very ramped up when designers use sort of 17 different kinds of screws when they could use one. So there's definitely a place for that. But as I think about design for manufacturability and encourage others to think about it in this way, it's not just about this checklist. It's really having a robust design that can account for the variability in manufacturing and really ultimately the variability in end use. So if you think about manufacturing, it's generally a physical process. I mean, we're not, software is a different consideration, but you're either molding something or assembling something, aligning something, and there's just sort of the inherent variability, hopefully tightly controlled, but not zero nevertheless. You've also got, and it's certainly in a larger setting, multiple different people doing the act of putting something together and testing it. So you've got, variation from person to person. So if you can imagine, you're coming into manufacturing with a design that is just operating on the hairy edge of its performance, any sort of manufacturing variability is likely going to put you on the wrong side of your performance spec. So designing for manufacturability is more than just kind of making it simple to put together. It's also having a design that can operate sort of well within the bounds of what to expect in manufacturing. Next point I want to make is it's generally true, and I don't want to sort of stereotype with absolute certainty, but people who work in manufacturing are generally of a different mindset than people who work in design. There's a number of people that I've encountered over the years who managed to sort of cross those lines sort of with equal ease, but that's the exception rather than the rule. And the people that I've known and worked with in manufacturing, are really sort of living and breathing, how do I make something the same way over and over again and make sure that I'm controlling my costs and make sure that I can, assure that something is going to be coming out of the end of this manufacturing process and meet the needs of the customer. And so, in living your life that way, you think about things a little bit differently than someone who's trying to figure out how to solve a tricky technical problem. And so it's really important to leverage this thinking and this mindset and this expertise during the design cycle, and having expert manufacturing engineers kind of part of the review process, and and even more importantly, not just sort of reviewing something and criticizing it, but being at the elbow of the designers and having sort of working conversations as things are evolving. That, in my experience, has done more good than almost anything else. Cost and other DFX drivers, really need to be considered sort of on equal par with performance. A lot of times, especially in a highly technical product, we're thinking about how to make it work. How is it going to meet its performance specs? But if at the end of the process you add up all the parts cost and find that it's, you've exceeded the what the business was looking for and how much it costs to make this thing, you haven't really generated a successful product. And I know I've been guilty of this in the past. It's like, oh, well, just, raise the price. I mean, what do I care? I've given you a beautiful design, but it's the notion of a successful product is not only one that works great, but one that can be sold into the market and be successful. And so, again, having cost as an afterthought at the end and looking for ways to take cost out of something is way more complicated and way more expensive than having something sort of thoughtfully designed from the beginning. Talked a little bit about testing previously. It's really important to think about how things are being tested, not only to come out with a good methodology for testing, but also to inform the designs. You can design something that's really hard to test, or you can design something that's really easy to test. And so, why not pay attention to that? And finally, supply chain. And this is, I was going to say a day doesn't go by when we don't think about supply chain these days. I don't think 15 minutes goes by right now when we're not having a conversation about a supply chain issue. Obviously, we're living in a strange and unusual time when it comes to getting things, but this has always been an important consideration, because of course, if you can't build it, you can't build it if you can't get the parts. And so you really need to be thinking about where are the sources of your material coming from? Are you stuck with a single source? Is there only one sort of specialist in the world that can fabricate the thing you need? And if that's the case, how do you mitigate that? How do you give yourself enough time to sort of really activate a supply chain, given that, even outside of 2021, things have long lead times. So the other aspect of sort of the product development role in a successful transfer to manufacturing is thinking about sort of what comes out of the product development process. There's an old saying / joke, depending on your point of view, what do engineers produce? And the right answer, quote unquote, is paper. Despite us engineers wanting to sort of look at this beautiful shiny thing sitting on a bench, doing something fantastic, it's really the instructions about how to make it that count. Because without that, it's obvious, right? You can't make it. You have to be able to buy parts. You have to be able to know that the parts that you're getting are acceptable and will work when assembled into the product. And this is not, ultimately in manufacturing, it's manufacturing people that are sort of executing on that, but it's really the development engineers that are sort of making the rules and of what needs to be done and how to do it, because they're the expert in what it is. And so, obviously lots of artifacts, bills of material, spec sheets, drawings, electronic assembly, and of course, acceptance criteria. So, and this counts for both, things that are fabricated, molded, machined, you name it, and there's even things bought out of a catalog. And then, of course, you need to know how to put it together. And perhaps more importantly, how do you know that you put it together right? And so all of the process instructions and manufacturing engineers are ultimately responsible for sort of, the finalization of those. But it's really, who starts building these things? Well, it's the engineers building it, the first prototypes. They're the ones sort of learning how to put these things together. And if you're doing it right, you're keeping track of that and taking lots of pictures and writing things down while you're doing it. And sort of having all those artifacts that smoothly let a manufacturer sort of take what you produce and start to be able to generate real products out of that. So with that, that's really the end of my section on sort of how how to sort of leverage Agile and Lean to march through product development, and then some thoughts on sort of what it takes to be successful as product development people to get into manufacturing. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Roger to wrap up.
Yeah, I go back to the very beginning. You know, this is that famous waterfall diagram that says, hey, product development is about a series of things that we just march through linearly. And it's just not the case. And I hope we were given the opportunity to sort of tell you that that's not the case, and it's not the thing that you want to do to be successful. What's really interesting is if you actually get that document, read it, you see this picture on the right, but you read the paragraph right after that picture. And it says, and I literally quote, in practice, feedback paths would be required between each phase of the process and previous phases, representing the iterative nature of product development. However, this detail has been omitted from the figure to make the influence of design controls on the design process more distinct. So I want to make it very clear that none of the things we're talking about are at odds with the FDA or the design process that they want us to do. I think everything we're talking about is completely fits within the paradigm, and will give you a successful product that is regulatory compliant. So I think with that, I think we're done. Hopefully we've been able to say a few things that might be useful, talk to you a few things, thought about things a little bit differently, and hopefully we wish you great success in whatever you're going to do in the product development process. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger and David, for your presentation. I feel like I've seen so many presentations about Agile versus waterfall over the years, and this is the one where things really felt like they clicked. So at this point, we're going to stop recording. We're going to open up Q&A,